And joining me now on the show is Steve Mosher. Steve is an international authority on China and population issues and is president of the Population Research Institute and author of the best-selling book, Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. Back in 1979, Steve was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China, where he had access to government documents and actually witnessed women being forced to have abortions under the one-child policy. He's the author of the best-selling A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy, and Hegemon, China's Plan to Dominate Asia and the World, and Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, it's good to be with you.
I appreciate your time today, and it just seems that we're following China in this almost a two-speed information economy. We always look to China as this great economic saviour, but anything is further from the truth given that China's Evergrande property is in freefall and now its chairman is facing something that they're calling police control. Can you tell us what's going on here to explain why we don't understand what's really happening in China?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party, quite frankly, has created an economic model that is unsustainable. The crushing of creativity, the crushing of innovation in the name of control, the recklessly escalating debt, the destruction of the environment, the destruction of human capital, right? 400 million people eliminated in utero and after birth by the one-child policy. Uh, but what you see in China's real estate market, of course, is all of these problems come to life. I spent years in China. And one of the things that started happening in the 80s and accelerated during the 90s and the early years of this century was that local officials would seize property from defenseless villagers, in many cases, razing to the ground entire villages, destroying the homes of that villagers had occupied for decades or maybe longer if they were family ancestral dwellings. And in their place, they would build these apartment buildings, thinking that the villagers would have no choice but to move into the apartment buildings and pay them rent. So the ground was expropriated, the land was expropriated. The local officials would go in with a property developer like Evergrande or a more local variant of Evergrande, build an apartment complex, thinking if they build it, they must come because otherwise they're homeless. The overbuilding of the economy is just tremendous. I mean, I've heard estimates of 70, 80, 90 million empty apartments in China. Now, you combine that with the fact of the half of the last two generations are missing. There's no one who's ever going to buy those apartments. China's gone. I mean, this is not just a layman moment, referring back to the American problem in 2008 with the collapse of one of the big banks of America. This is a fundamental problem that will literally hollow out and cause the collapse of the Chinese economy. My friend Gordon Chang back in 2002 wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. The U.S. and foreign trade have propped up China these last 20 years, but the collapse is coming, and I think it's right around the corner.
Two indicators, and one of them is just anecdotal, but in this particular story, the chairman of Evergrande's personal wealth has dropped from something like 40 billion to now under $2 billion. That's a massive indicator, 95% plus drop. One of my Chinese friends returned to her home in Shanghai only a few weeks ago and came back and said, you would not believe the price rises in China. This is obviously another indication that the economy is in real trouble. And that's the point, isn't it? That if a property market collapses, you've got literally hundreds of millions of Chinese property owners who are going to see their personal wealth, their life's work just go up in flames.
Yeah, all that wealth that existed only on paper is now gone because there are no buyers. The demographic collapse of the economy. I mean, the only sector of the Chinese economy that made a profit really over time was the export sector of the economy, and that's being challenged as well by the economic slowdown in the United States and other Western European countries. By the fact that Europeans, Americans, Australians, and the rest are now not very favorably disposed towards China and the goods that come from China. So that market is shrinking. And if the export sector, the only sector of the Chinese economy that works according to market principles, goes, there you have another fundamental pillar of the Chinese economy going to dust. So, yeah, I think China is in very, very serious shape right now. And, the collapse has taken longer than many of us thought. But when the collapse comes, it will happen virtually overnight. And charging the chairman of Evergrande with corruption is probably a last ditch effort on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to pass the buck, to
Mm.
blame the developer himself for the problems that really China's unsustainable communist economic system has in the end created.
The continuing threat, it seems to be sort of more hot air from China of the takeover of Taiwan as the one China policy, but the pressure from the West with the moves and counter moves here in Australia with AUKUS, etc., is a move potentially by China on a military level another one of these perhaps last ditch efforts that they may be forced into as another way to obfuscate from the reality of the economic woes?
Well, it's disturbing to me and actually very concerning that many senior generals in the People's Liberation Army have now been removed. That one third to one half of the Central Military Commission people have been arrested or disappeared, usually on corruption charges, but sometimes they simply disappear. We don't know why they're being held in secret jails. It's disturbing to me that Xi Jinping has now declared himself to be not just the chairman of the Central Military Commission, a post he's held for 10 years, but also he's now the commander in chief. He's equivalent. He's appointed himself to be the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. That is the direct commander of the active military forces in China, and he attends meetings wearing a uniform. If that strikes you like something that a dictator bent upon military aggression would do, I have the same feeling. And if in fact the Chinese economy does collapse, and I think we're seeing the beginning of that now, how will Xi Jinping save himself if not by launching some kind of foreign adventure to distract the Chinese people from the difficulties that he and his party themselves have caused? So I think a foreign act of aggression is almost a natural outcome of the domestic turmoil and unrest that is resulting from the ongoing collapse of the property market. And think about this. I'm reading reports in China from Chinese about municipal workers in medium sized cities in China not receiving pay and not just missing one pay period. Some of them are 6 months, 9 months in arrears. Local governments in China have gone bankrupt because they too got in on the property stealing and development scam. They too are sitting on masses of unsold real estate, and they too are bankrupt and holding debt that will never be paid back. So take that all together, put that all together, and you have a very volatile situation in China today.
It is absolutely remarkable to understand the bigger picture in the Chinese economy with all of that centralized power. It always tends to go the same way, that it's covering for something that most of us aren't allowed to see or want to see. Stephen Mosher, thanks for your time today on World Series News.
Thank you.